So I had been asked numerous times to do more responses on Viki in 1999. I've touched upon quite a few, so if you've got anything you would like me to do a response on in particular, tell me what video specifically. Let's just have a listen to what she has to say.
Hello and welcome back to Ideology Explained. Today we're talking about capitalism. You can already tell that the name of this series doesn't mean anything anymore because, and this is true, capitalism is not an ideology but an economic system. And before you rush to the comment section, I am aware that capitalism is part of many ideologies, but it itself isn't one. So let's go over the basics. In general, capitalism is just an economic system in which the means of production are owned by private individuals. Means of production is a Marxist term and just means the things you need to work, like a PC if you're an author or industrial machinery if you produce, I don't know, dildos. And what does that private ownership mean? Classically, it just means that it's not owned by the state or by the crown, but by whoever bought it. That means you can buy a piece of land and build a factory there and it belongs to you. And all of the profit it generates belongs to you as well, minus stuff like taxes. And that's it according to some definitions, but others put an emphasis on competition and such, which I disagree with. This is because nowadays capitalism has become synonymous with free market capitalism.
And this is where the dishonesty comes in, because they try to redefine capitalism. It is true in what she says about that of private individual owners rather than the state, but she's misconstruing that. It doesn't mean a private sector being strongly regulated, controlled and directed by the state. She leaves that out, however. Capitalism is about the free and voluntary exchange in the marketplace. Purposely she mentions about how, she disagrees with that. Of course she disagrees with that, because that's more or less what capitalism is. You can't take capitalism and remove it from individualism, and this is what they do. They do this all the time. They try to misconstrue what capitalism is, and they try to bastardize it and say, oh well, capitalism's a type of this and type of that and type this, that and the next thing. And of course they try to correlate it to do with this of corporatism. They need to do that in order to try and discredit capitalism. In other words, capitalism is an individualist system. Individualism and collectivism, capitalism's got nothing whatsoever to do with collectivism. Collectivism is antinomous to the word capitalism, basically speaking about, the system today, which is a mixed economy. You see the mixture between capitalism and socialism. There's somewhat of a mixture between the individualism to some extent and the collectivism to some extent. Of course, you see that with the public and the private sector, and you've probably heard these arguments before where these people use the terms, state capitalism, or they try to bastardize the name and they use the term, late stage capitalism, when there's no such thing. Really all it is defining a mixed economy. And the reason why they're dishonest in the use of terms is because they don't want to admit that a mixed economy has the presence of socialism. In other words, they want to exonerate socialism of the blame, and they basically want to say, oh well, this is just state capitalism, this is just late stage capitalism, this is the fault of capitalism, this is somehow a form of capitalism. It's all down to a question of scale. And in order for you to reach a socialist economy, you're going to have to introduce socialism more and more into the economy, and that's how you reach a mixed economy. So this is where the dishonesty comes in, because they are trying to paint the mixed economy as some sort of form and type of capitalism when it really isn't. Capitalism is the free market. It's the separation of business from government interference in the market. So when you look at this definition of individualism, you can more or less see it's defining the free market. In other words, the freedom for, individuals to freely regulate in the market itself in the absence of government regulation. And that's what it means when you speak about capitalism. Capitalism has nothing to do with collectivism. Anybody who tries to correlate this word collectivism with that of capitalism are wholly dishonest. You can see it through numerous sources, folk. Just about every source you could possibly find, collectivism is a word synonymous to the word socialism. You'll find that in umpteen sources. It's plastered everywhere. You can find socialism listed as a synonym for a good reason. And if you look at both definitions of collectivism and socialism, socialism, they mean more or less the same thing. That's what the word synonymous practically means. It means a word that means more or less the same as another word in the same language, etc., such as the word close just means the same thing as shut. Well, it's the same thing with regards to collectivism and socialism, pretty much. Sure, there are other forms of collectivism, we can more or less understand that. And it's this whole thing when it comes down to socialism, socialists purely define everything down to theory. I mean, I just recently had the argument on the whole thing to do with the communal ownership, and you know fine well, they love to repaint and redefine absolutely everything. Tries to redefine communal ownership and says, well, communal ownership is just really about the means of production. It's not so much about that to do with possessions, but that isn't the real world. They haven't got any real world examples to back up their so-called claim, and this is what they do. So it's the same thing with that of capitalism. You cannot remove, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, you cannot remove capitalism from individualism. It's an individualist system. Yes, we do live under a mixed economy today, and there is the mixture between capitalism and socialism, and unfortunately, in a mixed economy, you have the rise of the corporatist system, and that's just how things are. This person wants you to believe that socialism's not present. Instead, they're dishonest. They just say, oh, it's state capitalism. A sly move to try and exonerate socialism of its presence. A sly move of their dishonesty to try and exonerate socialism of the blame. The real world doesn't work like that. Socialism has to have presence because you have to use socialism in the economy in order to reach their end goal, because you cannot go from capitalism to communism overnight. There's no possible way for you to do that, because the fact people would never accept the sudden loss of their freedom. And again, it's the whole thing, they don't understand theory and practice.
And free market capitalism means an economic system made up of both the free market and capitalism. Personally, I believe that it's important to distinguish between those two. The distinction I make is that capitalism dictates how things are produced.
This is completely false, folk, because it is not a capitalist that dictates what gets produced. Capitalism is not pro-business. Anybody who thinks the market operates in the sense that capitalism dictates production doesn't understand the real world. A capitalist is aiming to make a profit. What sense is there in dictating production when you face the risk of losses? The reality is, a capitalist is forced into the economic reality that it's what consumers are willing to pay for stuff. And it's what the consumers want. So in other words, if a capitalist is going to create a business and they're going to, produce things, and maybe innovation stems from all of this, etc., they're going to have a market research department, and that market research department is going to look at that of what the consumers are buying most of and what they're not buying. Why would a company, face the risk of not even bother to doing market research, not even bother to looking at what consumers are spending on, and then the capitalist just decides to produce for what they think is best? Consumers are not robots. They're not forced to buy your products. If they're not buying your products, you're facing losses, and there's no incentive for any capitalist to do that. And she's also completely wrong for trying to differentiate capitalism from the free market, because essentially capitalism is an individualist system. Individualism is very, very clear of its definition. Very clear. You cannot for the life of you, and this is what it boils down to, folk, ideologies and systems can only fall under one of the two things. This is the reason why Edward G. Griffin pointed this out himself.
Those bankers are not capitalists. Most of those bankers, I guess the best word you would say for them is they're collectivists, which is another word of saying socialists. In every socialist country, you've got bankers, don't you? So what's the deal here? You see, where the problem is that words mean different things to different people. I have often said that if we stripped away all of these words, like communism versus capitalism versus socialism, fascism, Nazism, left versus right, conservative versus liberal, all of these words get in the way. The whole ideology boils down to a choice between two things. One is individualism, and the other is collectivism. Those words have meaning. They're not familiar to us, but if you look them up in the dictionary, you'll find pretty clear definitions that everybody can agree on. You may not like the definition. You might say, well, I prefer to be a collectivist rather than an individualist, but it's pretty clear what it means. Individualism, simply in a general sense, means that the basis of society is the individual. That's the most important element in society. And the purpose of the state is to protect the individual. And the state is the servant of the people. That's individualism. Collectivism, it's the other way around. The collectivists believe that the state or the group is the most important element of society. And the purpose of the people is to serve the state. And there's your choice.
And that is the very reason why her type and all the rest of these socialists utterly despise the argument on individualism and collectivism. Why else do you think I bring it up to them? I do so because the fact that there's no rational-minded person that could try and attempt to pull capitalism outside of individualism. To do that is basically to say that capitalism's got something to do with collectivism, and it hasn't. It's got nothing to do with collectivism. You could look up umpteen sources and you will find capitalism is listed as an antonym for that of collectivism. Something that's antinomous to something means that it's opposite in meaning. So in other words, capitalism is opposite in meaning to collectivism. Capitalism's got absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with collectivism.
The whole ideology boils down to a choice between two things. One is individualism, and the other is collectivism.
It's an individualist system. That's what they mean by the term laissez-faire capitalism, right? So basically it's French for individualism. So that's what you're speaking about when you're speaking about capitalism. Essentially, when you're speaking about individualism, you are basically speaking about capitalism, and individualism's been very clear of its definition. It's defining the free market economy.
For example, in a factory which is owned by a single private individual or a group of investors. So capitalism is the system of production. It produces things. And the market is a system of distribution, which transports stuff from the factories that produce it to the people who need it. I will not dwell on how markets work because that's actually a separate video already. Click somewhere. You need both a system of distribution and a system of production to make a full economic system.
Again, it's dishonesty on behalf of the socialists because the market is in correlation to capitalism. This is expressly the whole thing to do with capitalism. It's all to do with the free and voluntary exchange in the marketplace. Capitalism is all about the trade. It's all about consumers driving what production is, and the distribution, how it's done in a capitalist system, is through voluntary exchange, folk, and that is a big part of what a market's all about. Socialism's got nothing to do with the market. Any socialist who tries to correlate the market to do with socialism doesn't understand socialism. They don't even understand the first thing to do with economics. I covered that on the argument to do with market socialism, because what a market is really all about is all to do with that of individual buyers and sellers. It's about consumers driving what production is, and it's like I said, briefly touching upon it, when you're speaking about what is market and what's anti-market, just compare prices. The market determining what prices are freely in the marketplace through the laws of supply and demand, that is capitalism, because it's the market that dictates that. It's in reference to the freedom of a market. Now, those individual providers in a market economy are private individual owners. That's what it's referring to when you speak about a market. That's why the market's a contradiction. There's no such thing as having a market and then just bastardizing the entire meaning of socialism, because what socialism's defined by is economic central planning. And a big part of socialism, and in the real world, not theoretical nonsense that they speak of, because they would never accept market-driven prices. Never, ever.
On the level that people can afford. And while we're doing that, we have to do what they did in America after the Second World War. To those soldiers, for example, returning to New York City, they introduced rent controls.
They would never accept market-driven prices. You can see that evidence by the fact that they can't stand to see the higher prices in the market. And that's what happens in the laws of supply and demand. They try to defy the laws of supply and demand. They don't accept the laws of supply and demand, so they try to control prices. And that's what you call economic central planning of prices. It's done through a central governing body in practice. Not all the theoretical nonsense that they go on about, that they can't even provide you any real world examples, but the real world, of course, when you speak about the difference between capitalism and socialism. So really, the market's in reference to that of capitalism. It's this dishonest attempt to try and redefine socialism and try and pull capitalism away from the market. And the reason why they try to do that is because they're trying to rebrand socialism, because they can't defend socialism itself. It's because socialism was an abysmal failure, folk. It's just a dishonest attempt.
And I believe this distinction is important, because if you mix them up, then you can make some silly mistakes, like believing that market socialism is the same as capitalism because it has competing businesses. I just think that keeping the market and capitalism separate makes it easier to understand things.
There you have it, folk, the concession, and she doesn't even realise that she has conceded to the fact that there is the presence of competing individual private businesses. That's capitalism. Now, of course, we understand in today's mixed economy, the element of capitalism is that regarding the market, where you see individual businesses competing against one another. But in the mixed economy, what is not capitalism is all the issues to do with over-regulating the private sector to give the state the power to control and direct it, as well as many other things such as the subsidies, etc, etc. The market isn't free. But in reference, this is why, you know, the combination between capitalism and socialism, and that's really all what market socialism really is, folk. It's the mixed economy, because you've got the element of capitalism with the individual private businesses, etc, and the consumers driving what production is. That's essentially what capitalism is all about. What is not capitalism in reference to socialism, when they try to use this term market socialism, just basically socialism's the element of trying to control the market, trying to, you know, redirect the market, trying to control production, trying to control, you know, things like prices, etc. And you see that socialism through the minimum wage control, quality controls, quantity controls. It's about trying to control prices, etc, etc. That's what market socialism really is.
So that's the theory. Capitalism is just a system in which everything is produced and owned by private entities. But how does that work in praxis? How do I get to own this piece of land, and how can I make sure nobody else takes it?
And this is where we talk about prices, because like Thomas Sowell's example in relation to do with housing, he mentioned about the scarcity. Now these people think they can live in some sort of post-scarcity world. The issue being is that the importance of prices is that it rations scarcity and scarce resources, etc. So for example, the beachfront example that I gave. So there's only one beachfront, there's only so many, you know, houses you can build on the beachfront, and there's only so many people that can live in them. So since there's, let's say, 70 million odd people, who gets to determine who lives in them if you've not got a price system? It has to boil down to favouritism then, because not everybody can live in them. That's just economic reality. There's not enough room, there's not enough of a beachfront. You see, all of these things socialists don't even bother to think about. Also, you could go down the argument again when you look at history of communal ownership of property, and we're not speaking about the theoretical meaning of, you know, what they're trying to redefine communal ownership as. We're actually defining communal ownership by the real world examples of communal ownership. You know, the communal ownership that we saw of the totalitarian regimes, the communal ownership that you saw that led to the tragedy of the commons. There's a big difference between the communal ownership of what the real world saw and the solutions that solved the problem to that of the world that they live away in their fantasy, you know, world in their head. You know, it's like they've just made things up as they go along, such as, for example, the Cole, or whoever his name is, where he tries to, you know, manipulate the entire meaning of communal ownership. You look at, for example, the starving time prior to the Industrial Revolution. Well, it was pointed out that the reason for why the starvation occurred was because in the communal ownership, everything that was to be produced was to be put into a communal pool. So in other words, there was no, you know, working for the fruits of their own labour. There was no personal ownership of possessions. It didn't exist. It was actually the very reason why the tragedy of the commons happened in the first place, a real world example. And it was Sir Thomas Dale that identified the problem and said it was communal ownership that was the problem, and therefore that's why the private individual ownership was brought into place to, you know, rectify that problem. And of course, since moving towards the private sector, it created the incentive for the hardest working people to actually work hard. Now, of course, I'm not going to go down the road of everything to do with the economic calculation problem. I really don't need to, but you understand the very point. Private ownership of property is vitally important. It didn't just come around as a means of theft. It was brought around because people were dying of starvation. And that's why, you know, it's like arguing with a brick wall. You know, to them, what does history matter? Their theory matters more than that of recorded history. People invest in, you know, their private businesses and whatnot. And if you remove private individual ownership of property, you're removing people of their right to own their own private property in their house, etc. You know, who wants to live like that? I certainly don't, and I know a lot of people certainly won't want to live like that. They want to be able to own their own property. That goes right over their heads, and they'll probably even try to redefine that to try and fit it around socialism. This is the sort of people they are.
That's the job of the state. The state is a core feature of capitalism because it is the entity that enforces property rights.
Lies. It is not, and that's nothing to do with the meaning of individualism. It's got nothing to do with real-world historical examples of what the American Constitution stood for. It's got absolutely nothing at all to do with natural rights. And that is proof that Marxists and just socialists in general and social democrats, I even seen a social democrat make that argument, they don't understand individualism. They don't understand natural rights, and they honestly don't even understand American history and the American Constitution, because the whole thing to do with individual rights is that those rights are natural to you. In other words, the state does not have the power to take those rights away from you. Those rights are natural, they're God-given to you. The state does not grant you those rights. What they've basically done is they've taken something that's inherently collectivist and they've tried to push that off onto capitalism, and that's completely false. You could even do your research into individualism and collectivism, and what you will actually find is that when it comes to collectivism, it's the state that grants you your rights. That's why when you look at the Soviet Union Constitution, the state had the power to take those rights away from you at any given time. That was the very problem, because if the state grants you your rights, it has the power to take them away, because to grant you your rights is giving you permission over your rights. That's nothing at all to do with individualism, and what the American Constitution was defending was individuals' rights. It was in relation to do with individualism. That's the very reason why today there's even the struggle and a battle to try and remove individuals of their rights, especially over gun ownership. If what this person is basically trying to say, gun ownership of rights would have been gone a long time ago, that isn't the case. It's not to say that the American Constitution over so many years hasn't been abused, but it's a misrepresentation, it's dishonesty of basically what individualism is, typical of socialists.
Practically, that means you can buy a piece of land and you will receive a piece of paper that says that it's your land. And if someone else comes along and tries to take your land, then you call the police and they commit war crimes on the people who are trespassing.
That's not committing crime on the people. You're the one committing the crime. I love how you try to relabel that as the perpetrators are the innocent ones. You know, that kind of reminds me of just a recent video I came across of Sargon of Akkad, and someone tried to make the argument that Antifa going out and attacking people, that those people defending themselves shouldn't be able to defend themselves. I think it was Vosh who tried to make that argument. That's what that sounds like. If someone trespasses on your private property and is the perpetrator, they are the ones committing the crime. If they are the ones, infringing upon individuals' rights. That definition that she just gave there, that's not the state enforcing your rights, that's the state protecting your rights. There's a difference between enforcing and that of protecting. She's conflating the two as if they're the same thing. That's the state protecting the individual's rights. That right is the fact that that person had the right to own their own property and buy their own property, and they bought their property, and therefore it's their property. So all the state is doing is rightly protecting their individual rights. And that is basically the role of the state. Of course, some people could argue of getting rid of the state, but of course, that's what the state is within a monarchist system, classical liberalism, etc, etc. It's there to serve and protect individuals' property rights. So it's dishonesty again. It's basically taking this idea of someone You know, having the state there to protect them of their rights, bastardizing the entire meaning, relabeling that as if that is enforcing rights, and it's not.
Using tear gas is a war crime, look it up. This also has the effect that someone can own a factory and all the machines therein and have the full dictatorial power over the people who work there.
Let me explain to you why these people are extremely ignorant folk. Just like this example of someone going onto your private property, such as for example in your house. You know, if you didn't have private property rights, anybody could just walk into your private property, your house or whatever, and just help themselves to whatever it is, because there's no defining rights there. It was like that example you saw in Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, libertarian socialism in practice. And what happened when property rights were blurred and things were gone, and they tried putting their ideas into practice? Well, what you saw was an individual sitting in his car, losing his head because his car had been broken into and his car key was stolen. Funny enough, the person sitting behind the wheel, you know, moaning about things is a socialist and doesn't understand that that's the very reason why you've got private property rights, to create a defining distinction between who owns what, because if you don't have that, then people just take the attitude of helping themselves to whatever it is. Now, of course, when somebody owns their own property and owns their own house, somehow the one who's committing the crime is you for defending your own property. So if someone robs your house, if someone, you know, breaks into your house and takes something and you defend yourself to defend what you own, you're the one committing the crime apparently. And it's the same thing with private business owners, and I recently had just this argument here. They're trying to say that this is dictatorial. How's it dictatorial? Private business owner basically created the private business out of what? Out of their own labour, their own hard work, their own investment. They invested to create their own private business. They invested to, you know, buy all that capital. In other words, the machinery, the factory, etc. They invested in that. To take that away from them through the use of force is theft and violence. So the perpetrator is not the capitalist who starts his own private business. A capitalist is just another individual. That individual should have the liberty, the key word there, the liberty, to be able to start up their own private business and own their own capital and own what they possess, what they rightly bought into. To take that liberty away from them is anti-libertarian, and that requires authoritarianism. That is dictatorial, because to uphold that position, to remove private individual ownership, you require dictatorship. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, the only way that you're going to get rid of private individual ownership is through force, because private individual owners don't just give up their property through negotiating with them. And what entity is going to do that? The government. But what entity is going to take you there to get rid of the private sector completely? A dictator, because it's not going to be the type of character a Bernie Sanders or a Jeremy Corbyn, etc., because they don't have the gall to do so. The private sector is the one that finances the economy, so if you're going to reduce the private sector significantly, you're going to be left running the printing press. In practice, it drives inflation through the roof, and in order for that, you know, dictator to continue on, you know, removing the private sector, they're going to have to completely ignore people in society and all of the strife that they are suffering as a result of the economic consequences that the socialism has caused. That's the very reason why, in practice, it leads down the road of not just an economic catastrophe, but the type of person who is like a Nicolas Maduro. You know, you saw the economic mess of Venezuela in 2013. What did it require? It required the type of, you know, dictatorial type of character who doesn't take concern over people in society, just ignores them and then uses the police against them. So funny enough, the actual dictator is themselves, not the capitalist. It's consensual agreement to work for a private company. How the hell they can turn and redefine the entire definition of tyranny and redefine the definition of dictatorship. That's essentially what socialists do. They redefine everything, whether it's communal ownership, whether it's something to do with personal ownership. Doesn't matter what it is, socialists will always redefine it. That just because you have to work for a living does not equal dictatorship. That's the same for any system. It's not a rational argument. Someone who agrees by applying for a job, by going through a job application process, by consensually filling in an application form and even signing the application form, and even then going through that of job interview process. The job interview process involves the capitalist deciding whether you get the job or not. That's you applying for the job through consensual agreement. To conflate that with dictatorship is ignorance. And that's what these schools are producing today. Youthful idiots.
And if they try to do anything against it, you can call the police and have them arrest the workers. And this is the very first criticism of capitalism. It allows single people to take control of factories, which may affect thousands of lives, and businesses, which may affect billions of people.
If anything, they've actually affected their life in a good way. They actually made something of value. And like I said, most of Jeff Bezos and his wealth is not held in actual money, but held in the assets that he's invested in, etc., such as his company, etc. The amount of produce that he has made available on the market is remarkable. Of course, what the socialist does is the socialist just completely ignores all the products that are available and all the products that have been bought and sold. The only thing that they stare at is the fact that Jeff Bezos and how much, money he's been earning, or, something to do with the wages. I'm not saying there aren't problems today. They completely ignore the wealth that was created.
An employee pretty much has to do as an employer tells them to.
It was the company owner who produced the company, created everything to do, and it even invested in the capital that you're using. You're in his business, so of course you're going to have to do what your manager says. Do you go into someone's private property in their house and just, bemoan the owner and complain that they've got their own set of regulations over what you can and cannot do in their own property, and you also ignore the fact you've got the freedom to go and start your own private business in a free market? That fact is important because that's something you just brushed over.
Needless to say, anarchists have a very big problem with that. Another criticism of capitalism is the tendency towards monopoly. If you've ever played Monopoly, you know what I mean. This has many negative effects, like increasing wealth inequality between workers and employers, and preventing the founding of new businesses, which would treat the workers better.
You're an anarchist by theory, and that's where it ends, not in the real world, because you tried the anarchism within the CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and it was ending in disaster. There was the fights.
Someone get me those fucking keys from that fight!
It was leading to, quickly centralising its own form of government within the space of 2 weeks.
Has anybody here ever heard of the French Revolution before? That is another revolution, because people started putting property over lives. They started putting money over people. Does anybody here know what happened to the people who did not get on board with the French Revolution? Say it louder. Say it louder.
And of course, it was a disastrous failure. Question I've asked numerous times before: if you're going to get rid of private individual ownership, how do you keep that private individual ownership out of sight? You're going to have an overseer to ensure that. Now, you might like to call it a committee, but that committee is going to be the government. That's essentially what you saw in Catalonia. It was a terror group that formed and started terrorising other people in other ways. You've got no choice but to have a government with socialism, because you have to ensure that private individual ownership is never going to return. So you require a dictator, in other words. And like I said, how's the state just going to wither away? Once you've got rid of the private sector, those questions never get answered. So you're not an anarchist. As for the whole thing on the monopolies, again, what you socialists are very famous for is not just redefining words to try and suit your own agenda. What you're very famous for is making baseless claims with nothing to back up what you claim. There isn't a single example in recorded history where you could say capitalism resulted in a monopoly. That's where your dishonesty comes, and that was why you were trying to redefine capitalism. It's why you're trying to differentiate capitalism from the free market. You're doing that on purpose because you need to try and correlate capitalism with monopoly creation and its dishonesty. And you cannot show anywhere where a free market economy, in reference to capitalism, you can't show anywhere where a monopoly stemmed from the free market. Not one single example in recorded history can you show where predatory pricing resulted in a monopoly. You saw that with Herbert Dow's chemical company. Since you cannot create a monopoly through predatory pricing, as theoretically it's nonsense. The only way that you can create a monopoly is by restricting productive output, and the only way that you can do that is getting government to interfere in the private sector by strongly regulating it. That's the only way that you can do it, and that's exactly what happened with government's interference. And that was to blame on your socialism, that all you're trying to do is project it off onto capitalism. So that intervention is actually socialism. You're just being dishonest. What you're trying to do is you're trying to paint, you know, capitalism as one big thing, but it doesn't make logical sense. Because then how do you reach the position of a socialist economy? You have to introduce socialism into the economy. What do you think the mixed economy is? That's not the fault of capitalism. That's the fault of your socialism. You know, this is why it's like I said, trying to debate these people, you're debating someone who is basically moving the goalposts, you know, constantly. They're desperately trying to redefine socialism completely, and then they play the gaslighting. They play the game of their, you know, projectionism. But like I said, folk, you know, definitely if you've got any videos you want me to do, give me the recommendations. I'll get around to doing that. I've got a few others that had been recommended. I'll be sure to take note of that. I've not forgotten. So I will get around to doing a few of those things. Also, folk, you can of course follow me on things like that of my Parler. You can also follow me on Twitter and stuff like that, and even on, you know, my Facebook, which of course I've had to, you know, redo and everything, and I try to keep everything going. I just try to branch out as much as possible. I try to keep things as active as possible. I'm trying to really, you know, drive as much as I possibly can. Anyway, folk, hope you've enjoyed the video, and of course be sure to like the video, share the video, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.